You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count.
Welcome back, everyone, to Deer University Podcast. We have a special day today. I'm Steve Damaris.
And I'm Bronson Strickland. Good to be here. And we have a special guest with us. Recently graduated graduate student, Colby Henderson. Welcome, Colby.
Thank you, Dr. Strickland and Dr. Damaris.
Colby has been on our podcast about a year ago. Colby and his co-worker Ashley Jones at the time, now Ashley Chance, and they talked about their early efforts on this project. And Bronson, I thought I'd start out by kind of reminding people, this is what we have called various things, the Buck Movement Project, the Big Black River Buck Movement Project. The project was designed to answer an important question for our state wildlife agency, the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. Their questions tie into hunter concerns. Year after year, as in many states, hunters are disgruntled after the hunting season, maybe even during the hunting season, that they are not seeing as many deer as they should see or that they are expecting to see during the hunting season. And biologists, our friend and deer coordinator for the state, Bronson, William McKinley, he'd say, well, you know, the weather was such that the deer weren't moving, or there was an exceptionally high acorn crop this year, so the deer were, you know, at the acorns. They weren't necessarily where you were hunting. And these explanations to biologists like us make sense. But to hunters that are concerned about, I'm not seeing deer, we've shot too many deer, your regulations are allowing too much hunting, too much harvest, the deer population is declining, where are the deer? We've got a problem. And so the agency came to us and said, hey, we need more than just verbal explanation of what we think is going on. We need to prove what is happening in these hunted deer populations here in Mississippi.
And if I could add to that, Steve, over the last 5 years, 10 years, and even longer with the advent of trail cameras, for the longest time it would be a biologist say something like, they're there, trust me. We see the tracks, we see the sign, we know deer are there. Then we add trail cameras into the mix, and hunters are indeed seeing photographs of these bucks. So they know they're still on the property. They may be getting the photos at night, but they know sooner or later these bucks are still around. And that, again, kind of fit in, Steve, to the big picture. We know they're still there. We're still getting a photograph of them, but where are they? Where are they spending time? How are they changing both throughout the season, and are they changing as a result or from the influence of hunting pressure?
Yeah. And we did a similar project, Bronson, a few years back, maybe 10 years now, with our friend and fellow biologist Ken G. with the Noble Foundation. And in that study, we had a much smaller area, but we had total control over it. And so we had a heavily hunted, high hunter density area, a low hunter density area, and an unhunted area. And we looked at how opening weekend of deer season, of gun season, affected movements during the subsequent 2.5 weeks of their very short gun season in Oklahoma. And we showed some very significant impacts that after the opening weekend, the deer visibility dropped dramatically. Hunters were not seeing as many of our collared deer, but we knew from their movement data that they were in the areas that these hunters were hunting. So we proved after the fact that the deer were there, the hunters just were not seeing them, and the deer changed their behavioral characteristics. They moved more in a tortuous way, more their total movements didn't change, but they moved within smaller amounts of habitat and smaller areas and kept more to cover. And so we showed that very clearly for folks in Oklahoma.
So for tortuous, that's always a can be a confusing word. Another way to say it, if you're going from point A to point B, you can go in a straight line. Or if it's a real tortuous route, it's going to be a very complicated squiggly line.
Yes.
Getting from point A to point B.
Yeah, and if point A to point B is 1,000 yards and it's straight line, it's going to be 1,000 yards away. But a deer could walk 1,000 yards but never leave a 100-foot square area, just walking around. Basically think about it as rounding around in circles within that 100-foot area, get just as many yards moved, but they're not moving across country. And so they're
not covering any ground and therefore exposing themselves such that a hunter could see them.
Exactly. So we had this proof from Oklahoma that deer are impacting that hunters are impacting how deer move. But here in Mississippi, they have instead of a 3-week gun season, we have almost 3 months of gun season. And we have a different system of hunting here, not nearly as much control over hunter access like we did in Oklahoma. So we had this different situation, and we had the acorn question, and Oklahoma's drier, Mississippi's wetter. So we really needed to do this study here in Mississippi, and that's where Ashley first and then Colby came in, and they worked their butts off. Colby, you want to tell us real quick how hard you worked your butt off capturing all these deer?
Very, very hard, Dr. Damaris. It was a lot of long hours at all times of the day, 8 o'clock in the afternoon to 3 in the morning, depending on when we were doing it. So it was a fun time, but it was also a very heavily worked time.
It's fun when you're done.
Yeah,
it's fun to look back on.
Yeah, and it's fun the first day and evening that you're sitting in the dark on a stand with infrared scopes and trying to dart a deer. It's a lot of fun for the first night, the second night, maybe the third night. But after about the 23rd night in a row, it's not so much fun. So you and Ashley and your technicians captured, we had 55 radio collars. You captured 55 bucks, put them out, and studied these. The deer collected the data for us over a 2 hunting seasons, 2017-18 and 2018-19 here in Mississippi. And you're going to talk to us today about your results for just during the gun season, which starts basically a 3-month period, November, December, and January. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. The gun season starts right there in the beginning of November and goes all the way till the end of January.
So by gun season, we're talking about primitive weapons and modern firearms for a period of 3 months. So Colby, you caught these 55 bucks and actually caught more than 55 over a 2-year period, because some died, some got hit by cars, some were shot by poachers, some were shot by hunters, so some died of natural mortality. So you caught more than 55, but you had a whole bunch of trapping effort and collared deer roaming over about a 50,000 acre study area along the Big Black River. Big Black River bottoms. So we had a large area of bottomland hardwoods, which had a very prevalent component of oaks with lots of acorns. And then we had some upland oaks. We had upland pine stands. We had ag fields. We had hunters created food plots. We had summer food plots, winter food plots. Some of the properties allowed feeding and recreational baiting during the hunting season. So we had a lot of things going on from the hunter's standpoint on this 50,000 acre study area. What about the deer? How did they collect their data?
So after we capture these deer, like you just said, we capture deer over a 2-year period, and we put these GPS collars on them. And then so for this firearm season, the GPS collars took a location of these deer every 15 minutes. So just as these deer were walking on the landscape, every 15 minutes that GPS collar took a location, and then 15 minutes later took another location. And so we had a lot of information from all these different deer, and I think total we had over 500,000 locations just during this firearm season. So there was a lot of information that these deer provided us during this time frame.
So what did you learn?
We learned a lot of stuff. There's a lot of very interesting things that we learned. Not only did we learn, how the deer were responding to hunters and how hunters were hunting on the landscape, but we learned, what areas on the landscape they were using more than other areas based off of the hunting pressure.
That reminds me something I didn't describe yet. We knew where the hunters were hunting and when they were hunting. How do we do that?
So we had the hunters on these properties. We had them record their hunting effort data, which just means they need to record where they hunted, when they began their hunt, and when they ended their hunt. So if someone started hunting at 6 o'clock in the morning and sat in a stand until 9:30, they recorded the location of that stand, and then they also recorded how long they were there. And so we used this information so we knew exactly where the hunters were hunting on the landscape based off of what they told us, but then we also knew where the deer were during these same exact time periods.
And some of the hunters didn't have cell phone reception, or they didn't want to use cell phones, but they also had an app that is an MSU Deer Lab app. Dr. Strickland, what's that called?
Deer Hunt is what it's called. Deer Hunt. What's our slogan? You can't manage what you don't measure. So it's an application. We've talked about it before on the podcast, but it's an application where you can collect all of your biological data, all the data that you normally collect when you get back to the skin and shed, how many deer you saw, things like that. But you just record it in real time right on your phone.
So we had this hunter data. So Colby, you want to start out by telling us what kind of habitat selection did the hunters do?
Yeah, so what our hunters did, we have all of these different land covers that these hunters could select for. And what they most selected for is probably not really surprising to any of us. They most selected for summer food plots, winter food plots, and then feeders. So hunters were generally wanting to be near these areas more than the other areas on the landscape. But they also selected for the bottomland hardwoods, like you mentioned. During this firearm season, the acorns are dropping, so people do want to hunt in those bottomland hardwoods to have access to deer that are coming to those areas to find acorns. But then the hunters were also using the fallow fields, the agricultural fields, the upland pines, and the upland hardwoods.
I would add too, for people that aren't familiar with that area, it's a really diverse landscape. I think that was really interesting about it. It wasn't just an agricultural landscape or just a forested landscape or just a pine forest landscape. It really has a mix of about everything you're going to find in the southeast except for the coast. you could find in this 50 to 60,000 acre area, bigger river running through it, floodplain, just about everything. So a very, very diverse landscape.
What kind of bucks did you capture, Colby?
So we captured adult males. So all these were antlered bucks, and they ranged anywhere from 2.5 to, I believe we even had a 7.5-year-old. And so this is everything from just a 6-point to, we even had at one point a 12-point that was collared. So it was a wide range of different types of bucks, but it was deer that people really wanted to shoot. And so that was within this project, we asked the hunters not to shoot these deer for us, because obviously if they shot these deer, we couldn't record the information. And it was a little hard for some of the hunters to not shoot some of the big deer they saw with our GPS collars on them.
Yeah, and actually some of them didn't not shoot them.
Yes, there was a couple that did get shot by hunters. I guess the itch to harvest the deer was too much. They just couldn't not do it.
And then some got harvested, poached at night. So we lost a few deer to harvest, but most of them weren't killed during the hunting season. But there still was a lot of hunting pressure on this property. I think over 1,000 deer were harvested per year on this 50,000 acre area.
Yes, over this entire area that we worked on average, it was over 1,000 deer that were harvested. Of those 1,000, it was probably 300 to 400 that were bucks. So there was a lot of hunting pressure that was taking place. So there really was risk on the landscape that the deer were responding to.
Why don't we get into some results? Let's talk about what you found.
So first, like we were just mentioning, we have what our hunters selected for. And so again, they mostly selected for the summer food plots, the winter food plots, and the feeders that were on the landscape. But they also did use the upland hardwood areas, the upland pine or the evergreen areas, our herbaceous areas, fallow fields, and then those bioman hardwoods. But they actually never used or did not select for agricultural crop fields. And so during this firearm season within our study area, all of our crops are harvested. So it's all just barren fields of just dirt. So our hunters actually did not actively select to be near those areas. But what's interesting about what the hunters were selecting for is that on average, they selected for the summer food plots, the winter food plots, and the feeders a lot more than the other areas on the landscape. For example, they selected the summer food plots 5 times more on average than the other areas, winter food plots 9 times more, and then for feeders, they selected for feeders more than double. So those 3 areas were really the highest risk areas on our landscape, because that's where the hunters were always selecting to be near when they were hunting.
Okay, so if you were trying to find a hunter, those are the places you would go, because the hunter data, their selection data, is telling you that that's where they are.
Yes, this data was telling us that hunters were very much wanting to be near these areas. So yeah, if you wanted to find where someone was hunting, search a food plot or around a feeder.
And I think that makes perfect sense. All of us are hunters, and we've been on properties all the time, and people are at the sign out shed. At least that's the way some of them do, and here's the map and where you're going, and most people are going to go climb in a stand, a box blind, a ladder stand, whatever, and it's going to be near a food plot or something like that. And so this was very similar to, I guess, what we thought going in. The data revealed that very pattern, but it's really striking to me when you look at these data is there were just very few hunters. There was a little bit people hunting in these bottomland areas or in the forested areas, but good grief, yeah, 5 times the amount of selection for summer food plots and 9 times the amount of selection for our cool season food plots. And let's clear one thing up here, Colby, is that when you started out here, you said, we're in the firearms season. So we're in November, December, January, and we're talking about summer food plots. And so I would imagine there might be some people thinking, why in the world would you be at now a summer food plot where that crop is dead? Can you kind of explain what generally was going on these properties with summer food plots?
Yeah, so for our summer food plots on our study area, a lot of them were planted in deer vetch, which is producing a lot of high protein food. It also grows very tall, 5-6 feet, so it's also providing a lot of cover for deer to hide in. But it also lasts until first frost, which here in Mississippi can be December 10th. So really, until that first frost, these areas are providing a lot of cover for deer. And so maybe that's why hunters are wanting to select for them, because not only are they providing forage, but it's also providing places where they know deer may want to go hide in, to maybe hide from where hunters are trying to hunt them.
Yeah, yeah. I would certainly agree with that. And it may be realizing that during that transition from before it frosts until after it frosts, again, as you said, I'll just reiterate, deer vetch, when it's not browsed heavily, if it's browsed heavily, it may never get above knee high. But in some of these places where there's a lot of food on the landscape, the deer vetch could get 4 foot, 5 foot, 6 foot high, and it can have a woody stem, and so it does provide structure. And so that went from a food source until frost and shortly thereafter to probably a source of cover that was probably bedding, and hunters probably figured out real quick that that is a very obvious bedding area on the landscape that they can hunt adjacent to and probably catch a buck leaving that area.
And then, some of our other summer food plots, they weren't all planted in deer vetch, but then some people, they just allow their food plots to go fallow. And so it's just, now you have just tall grass that is now growing up. And so it's still, like you were just saying, providing that cover or bedding areas that deer could maybe use, which is, again, why hunters would maybe want to hunt near those areas.
Hey, one more thing, Colby, in explaining these results. How close would a hunter have to be to, let's say in this case, your cool season or your winter food plots? How close would a hunter have to be to that food plot for your location to be categorized as the hunter was at the food plot? So does it literally mean they are on the edge of the plot, or could they be back 100 yards from the plot? Where was the threshold for categorizing on or off the plot?
That's a good question. So yeah, this does not mean that a hunter had to be literally sitting in a box blind in the middle of the food plot or sitting in a tree stand on the edge of it. They could be 50, 75, 100 yards away from that food plot and still be considered, right there where that food plot is located. So yes, it definitely does not have to be, the hunter does not have to be on that area to be considered in that area.
Okay. And that's just the way you analyze the data, is you're just putting buffers, using these buffers you're putting around the location, and then you're kind of categorizing what is the vegetation type or habitat type most found in that buffer around the hunter location.
Yeah, so like we mentioned previously, we have the hunter locations, and then like you just said, we put this buffer to sort of see what was located in this buffer around each location to describe what was locally available to the hunters. So if they were at this area, what is around that area that hunters may be selecting for? And so in general, they were generally near winter food plots, summer food plots, and feeders over other areas on the landscape.
Okay, so I think we've got a darn good depiction of, if you were going to hunt a hunter, where to go find them. Winter food plots, summer food plots, and feeders. How about we transition now to figure out where the deer are at?
That's probably the question that people are more interested in.
Probably so.
I would assume most hunters know where they always like to hunt, and they are listening to this because they want to know where deer were. And so within our landscape, for those natural land covers, those upland hardwoods, the evergreen areas, the upland pines, the fallow fields and the bottomland areas, deer were using those areas. However, they were also mainly using those summer and winter food plots and feeders. But that does not mean they didn't use these other areas. And so when we were calculating where the hunters were, we wanted to see how deer were responding to, as more people began to hunt on the landscape, what were those deer doing? So during the weekdays, a Tuesday, a Wednesday, when not many people are hunting, what were those deer using? And so they were using the agricultural fields. They were using those upland hardwood areas. They were using those pines, fallow fields, and bottomland areas. And then as more people began to hunt, the selection for those areas decreased. So when the lowest number of people are hunting, deer were using these areas. As more people began to hunt, more people were on the landscape hunting. There was more risk associated with areas on the landscape. Selection for those upland hardwoods, those bottomland hardwoods, and pines began to decrease. However, the selection for summer food plots, winter food plots, and feeders didn't follow that same pattern. As more people began to hunt, deer were still showing us that they were selecting for those areas, which, like we just talked about, those are the areas that hunters were most wanting to be near. So those areas were the highest risk areas where more people were hunting, but deer were still always wanting to be near those areas.
That was one of those oh my goodness moments for ourselves during the analysis, wasn't it, Colby?
Yes, we looked at it and it was kind of like what the heck is happening here? I mean, the summer food plots and winter food plots for the deer selection were selected for 2 times more than everything else. So even though the deer were using the upland hardwoods or the bottomland hardwoods, they were still using the summer food plots and winter food plots 2 times greater than those other areas. So like you just said, that didn't really make sense to us. Why are deer using areas where hunters are? If hunters are hunting on the landscape, they're always hunting at a winter food plot. Why would deer want to be near that winter food plot?
Yeah, and we were supposing that up front that deer would be responding to risk. So the natural habitat areas, clearly there was an avoidance of those areas when there was more hunting activity. On days with more risk, higher risk days, they avoided those habitats more so than they did when there was lower risk. So deer were behaving kind of like we expected, but the kicker was, why are they in these food plots, which is where the hunters are?
Yeah, it like you said, it was really just a shocking thing to us. It didn't make sense. We couldn't really explain it to ourselves, what was happening.
Because in this particular analysis that you're talking about, it was over a 24-hour period.
Yes, it was at the overall, that 24-hour period, that all-day selection, what the deer were doing. So yes, it was all what the deer were doing over this 24-hour period. But I do want to go back a little bit and talk about those natural areas before we move into that answer. With those natural areas, like you just said, Dr. Damaris, the selection decreased as more people began to hunt. And so we actually saw a hunter and deer mismatch in that natural cover. So the areas that were most selected for by hunters, the evergreen and fallow fields, those herbaceous areas, those are the most selected for areas by the hunters. However, they were the least selected for areas by deer. So it's almost like deer were identifying, over at this area, that's where hunters are, so I'm going to go somewhere else. So it's almost like deer were identifying where hunters were on the landscape, and then they were altering the areas they were using based on that hunter presence.
Smart deer.
Yeah, they have learned, I guess we can say they've learned how to avoid hunters a little bit for us.
That's really advantageous for prey to avoid the predator. So let's give the deer credit for that. They figure us out.
And then, so going back to that other question you were talking about, Dr. Damaris, at that 24-hour scale, it looked like deer were selecting for areas where hunters were. However, if we look at the if we look at the habitat selection by the time of day, or during the daylight hours, basically 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., 8 p.m. at night, what were the deer doing? They actually were not selecting for winter food plots over everything else. They were actually selecting for these upland hardwood areas, the bottomland hardwood areas, and again, those summer food plots more than those winter food plots. And again, I want to mention, like Dr. Strickland said, those summer food plots are providing bedding cover during this time of the year. And so during the day, it really looks like deer aren't using winter food plots, or even feeders at that. They're using them the same that they were as upland pines, but less than other areas on the landscape. So they really weren't this super attractant to deer like many people tend to think of them as.
At least during the middle of the day.
Yeah, during the day, people were out there hunting. Deer were using those areas less than other areas on the landscape, which kind of, I mean, if you think about how many times you've gone and hunted over a food plot during the day, kind of makes you feel not very smart.
Well,
at least like the deer were outsmarting you.
Well, they typically do, but we also think of it like this. We have all had many successful hunts on food plots as well. So we're in no way saying that deer are not visiting food plots during daylight hours, because we all know as the sun is setting, let's take afternoon for example, as the sun is setting, more and more deer will start trickling in. But if you were to look at that period of time, let's just say an hour before dark or 30 minutes before dark, if you were able to number all the deer, if you had a sample of 55 bucks on the landscape, most of them would not be in the food plots. A few of them may be, but most of them are in these other natural areas, and then after the sun sets, they may move in later.
Yes.
So, it's just a careful kind of nuanced context, because hunters are so, and this hunter included, go hunt on a food plot in the afternoon, very good chance you're going to see some deer. There's also a good chance you may not. But we're kind of looking, we're telling the story from the population average. Where are most of the deer spending time at that part of the day? Some of them could be on the food plot. Some of them may still be in the forest. In fact, most of them in this study area were in the forest until dark.
Yes, that's a good way to explain it. We definitely do want to say, deer still are using those food plots. But at the population scale, they're not all going to be in that food plot during the day when people are hunting.
Right.
And for those that are both listening and watching on the YouTube channel, you have a figure that shows that nighttime expansion of deer selection, right?
Yes, and so that what we just explained was the selection for those variables during the day. But now if we add in where they were selecting for during the day and the night, you now see a different story. We actually see an increase in winter food plot selection. Actually, we see a 5-fold increase, to where now during the nighttime, when no one is hunting on the landscape, winter food plots are now the most selected for variable there in the area that deer are wanting to be in. So at nighttime, winter food plots, that was the place to be for deer, winter food plots specifically. But then the summer food plots also did increase in selection 2-fold from day to night.
So did you conclude the summer food plots were providing cover during the day, but then also food, so there were additional deer coming in at night to eat.
Yes, so summer food plots were also providing forage at this time. Deer could come in to these areas, eat some of the stuff growing. If it hasn't frosted yet, then that deer vetch or whatever else you were growing is still providing a lot of good forage for deer during that time frame.
As well as naturally occurring what some people may call weeds. But yeah, other cool season broadleaf plants that are coming in are also providing food in those summer food plots during the cool season.
And so another thing for the people that are listening and watching on YouTube, another thing I like to point out about this graph is that selection for those agricultural fields has now switched. Deer are now actively using those agricultural fields during the nighttime. And so it's sort of the same thing with the food plots. While they are harvested fields, there still is some, like Dr. Strickland just said, some weeds that are growing that deer then have access to when no one's hunting during the nighttime.
Yeah. Colby, one thing I wanted to visit was when you were looking at hunting pressure. So you had these different times where it was more risky from a deer's perspective to move around. You had kind of the average day, the average hunting day. You had below average hunting days, and you had some way above average hunting days. And regarding the natural vegetation and cover, you essentially saw a decrease in all of them. You saw a decrease in bottomland hardwoods. You saw a decrease in the herbaceous. You saw a decrease in the upland forest and the evergreen. And, that was one thing you had to explain to me, because I remember kind of questioning you about, how can this be? How can they all go down? If they're not in these areas, they have to be somewhere. They have to go back up, or they have to spend their time somewhere. And the way you explained that to me was, in these really, really risky times, there's not a good pattern. It's almost like at random, wherever they can find a safe place to hunker down, that's where they're choosing. And at the population scale, there's not like this population average of where they're going to shift and move. It's just kind of each buck for himself where they go and hide. Is that still your opinion?
Yes, that's a good way to think of it. At the highest risk time, or when more people were hunting, when those weekends, those Saturdays and Sundays when no one's working and more people are out there hunting, you may have 10 people on a property hunting. There really wasn't a pattern to what those deer were doing. They were just trying to find wherever they could to hide from those hunters. They just did it. It didn't necessarily matter what it was. Just as long as they found somewhere that they felt safe, that's the area they used.
And we're going to be learning a whole lot more about these individual choices that bucks make. This is, as Dr. Strickland mentioned, this is kind of the average response. But Bronson, you picked one out the other day and looked at his movements. Why don't you share that example?
Well, unfortunately, Steve, it was more than just the other day, and so I'm now having age-related issues with recall, with memory. No, hopefully I could remember the high points. Yeah, it was really interesting, and so this was a sample size of one. It was literally picking a buck at random, and I just wanted to see how he navigated the landscape, throughout the day and throughout the year. And I think what astounded me the most, and it really helped, we'll share this sometime, Steve, we can actually put up the slide or the figure and show this, was that these bedding areas were moving all over the landscape. This particular buck, so I'm committing a sin now, Steve, that we talk about all the time. you're picking out an individual. This is an anecdote. This isn't the population average. So I qualify with this is an anecdote. But imagine if it was only like 300 to 400 acres over a couple month period of time. And I think we all have this vision of this is the buck's bedding area, and it's going to go out during the day, or it's going to have his morning, dawn feeding bout and come back to this bedding area or a couple different bedding areas. And, that's going to be the pattern. This bedding area, or one or two of them, that's where that buck's going to be bedded. But what we really saw is it was moving all over the place, almost like creating a loop. There would be a bedding area during the middle of the night. Then there would be a morning feeding bout. And, and it may be 1,000 or 1,500 yards away, a midday bedding area. Get up, go for the afternoon, evening feeding bout, another bedding area. And it just literally over that 3, 4, sometimes 500 acres. Gosh, I can't remember how many we picked, Steve. 30? That seems to ring a bell, like 30 or more different places the buck was bedding.
Yeah, and amazingly, one of those places that he bedded, if I remember correctly, was a fence row running down the middle of a wide open ag field. And might have been a 6-foot wide fence row with some shrubs growing in it, some tall grass, and this adult buck was hanging out on this fence row out in the middle of the ag field.
Yeah. Now I remember that. Yeah, he had two places like that. One of them, during the middle of the day, best we could tell, again, from the, we're zooming in from an aerial photo. But it was very linear. It looked like it was a fence line, and you could tell there was cover around it. But it was a safe place for him. And it's kind of like getting back, Colby, what we were saying a moment ago about it's just a spot. It's not like a population average that we can classify as it was a piney woods area or a bottomland hardwoods area. It was just, there's a spot, and it's providing cover, and the buck knew it was safe there. He had another spot. I could tell from the map that it was years and years ago a wet area. And we're not talking about a big area. We're talking about an acre, maybe even less. But it was a really wet area in part of this agricultural field where they no longer farmed because it was too wet. And it was growing up, by now into trees. I'm sure it started with shrubs, but now trees. And that buck hung out in that little spot all the time. So just another case in point, Colby, to what you were talking about is when the hunting pressure increases, I wish we could come away with this and say, when hunting pressure is intense, go to these particular vegetation types, go to these areas. But we can't. All we can say is they're going to find a spot. Of course, it's going to have some cover, and that's where they're going to set up.
So we've learned where hunters hunt. We've learned where deer live, and we've learned. I love the analogy you have here about this deer hunter mismatch, Colby. That's a great way to represent it. How do we help people put this into some kind of a management context? How do people fix this?
Yeah, so I guess that's probably the ultimate question that, the whole reason we wanted to do this project is, how do we use these results to tell people how they can maybe fix this issue where the deer are using areas that the deer or that hunters aren't using. And so the best way to answer that, like we talked about in the beginning, the deer were using areas where the hunters weren't hunting as more people began to hunt on the landscape. So when less people were hunting, deer weren't changing their behavior as much. And so the easiest answer to that question, Dr. Damaris, is just to control the hunter density on the landscape. And so instead of everyone hunting on a property on a Friday or a Saturday, maybe distribute that hunting pressure over that entire week. And so deer are then exposed to a lower hunting risk across that entire time frame. And that's likely going to keep those deer from changing their habitat selection as much as they normally would during those high-risk times. Because again, you're just exposing the deer to a lower overall risk level because less people are hunting during one specific time frame.
Okay, so hunt when the deer aren't expecting you to be there.
That's probably, if I could say one sentence of how to explain it, that would probably be the best sentence. Yes. Hunt when you normally maybe wouldn't, or when deer don't think you normally are. But you could also simply just control the number of hunters that are on a property. Instead of having, the whole family come out, having 10 people hunt on 20 acres, maybe only have 5 or 4. And again, that's just reducing the hunter density on the landscape and just exposing the deer to less overall hunting effort. And that's going to likely keep them from altering their selection as much. And maybe increase hunter success because as deer don't alter their selection as much, maybe you have a better chance to see them and a better chance to harvest that deer you're after.
Mm-hmm. And you showed that there's this mismatch between hunters and deer in the food plots relative to the food plot use, and it's more of a time of day mismatch. So how does a hunter take what you've learned there and apply it to improve their hunting success?
So if we know that deer are using areas that are providing cover during the day, when more people are out there during the day, deer were generally using areas providing cover. And then foraging in areas at nighttime when no hunters were present, maybe instead of posting up and hunting on top of a food plot or near a food plot, position yourself between where you think deer are bedding down and then between that bedding area and that food plot to maybe catch the deer as they move from one area to the next. Because eventually deer do have to leave their bedding areas to forage in the areas they want to forage in. So if you can maybe catch the deer as it moves from one area to the next, that would, again, could likely increase your hunter success.
So I'm going to represent us working people that may be sitting back and saying, "That's great, Colby. I wish I could choose what days I can hunt, but I work. I'm off Saturday or I'm off Sunday, and unfortunately, your data are really clear. Those are the days that deer most likely are going to change their behavior somewhat. But I want to hunt, and I'm going to go. I'm going to take what you just spoke about, and that's how I'm going to incorporate it. Rather than getting so close to the food plot, I'm going to back off of it a little bit more. So, we know even when hunting pressure is intense, we know deer are going to use those food plots. Maybe not early in the afternoon, it may be at night when they're exclusively using it. But, and this is just, classic, what people have always said that really hunt pretty hard and are really trying to chase, especially an old mature buck, is don't hunt right on the food. Find those trails where they're entering the food plots and back off of them. Hundreds of yards, maybe 1,000 yards. And that would be one way where if you had 2 people, I'm just going to go hunt the edge of the food plot on a very hunting intense day versus going to that same property on that same day, choosing to back off the food plot 500 or 1,000 yards. You may increase the likelihood of success by doing that.
Yes, that is definitely a way to use those results. Because like you just said, in a perfect world, you could choose when you hunt, but not everyone can do that. So what you just said, that is a very good example of how you could use these results to even if you can only hunt on a Saturday or Sunday, use these results to change the behavior, like you just explained, Dr. Strickland.
I think about it, if I'm a manager, and I could manage hunters, which, it's easier to manage deer, I think, rather than manage hunters. But if I could manage hunters, I might say, like you said, Colby, let's spread the effort out. Let's try to allocate it a little more evenly. But then if I'm the hunter side of it, I would look at that information, the same way and think, all right, this is going to be a big day. It's Saturday and everybody's going to be there. Then this is how I would change my hunting style or method. So again, two ways to look at it. Well, Steve, did you have any more questions for Colby regarding this topic?
Man, we are going to keep learning. We have such a huge data set on these bucks, and we're going to learn more and more. And Colby's agreed to stay around for another year and work for us as a research associate and analyze this data some more. So stay tuned, I'd say, to our audience. This is just the first lick.
Yeah, I'm happy. I'll tell you what, Colby's really he's a glutton for punishment to hang around us for another year or so. But we are most appreciative, Colby, and we cannot wait to keep digging in, asking more and more specific questions. It's going to be a lot of fun.
I can't wait to start working on it. I think we have a lot of interesting things we can really answer that people want to have answered.
Okay, well, thank you, Colby. Appreciate you spending some time with us today. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate you as well. Thanks for all the leadership for this project as well. I know people don't realize how much money and time and effort. It is a really fun project, but it took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get these data. So, Steve, you really took the lead on that. So thank you for managing this project. And I think that's a good place to wrap it up, everyone. So again, thanks for your time, and more to come.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.
Natural Resources University is funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. New episodes are released every Tuesday. For more information, follow us on our social media platforms at @NR_University.